All right, so in this video, we're gonna walk through the top things that we see when we're working with our clients in regards to repair requests, the items that come through through these repair requests. And a lot of times are minor things that add up, but that, how we are helping our home sellers, our homeowners get ahead of these things, ahead of their actual home inspection in order to be able to save them thousands. So let's go ahead and jump right in. Hey guys, it's me, Bill Stewart with Remax Moves here. I run the Bill Stewart Homes Team here, and we have just gotten through three different transactions. And of the three, two of them went through a repair request that were, I would say, somewhat contentious in terms of what a buyer felt needed to be fixed and the cost of what those things should be. The other was the seller who's like, this is no big deal. I'm not paying for that. Or we priced the home that way, or we did these things. Either way, it just became kind of it can sometimes be either very cordial or very challenging. And these ones were a bit challenging. And some of the things that were on these reports, as a homeowner myself, I looked at and was like, this is kind of minor. I mean, this is pretty easy to fix. There's no reason for us to do it. In fact, if you need me to come over, I almost want to do it myself. But the idea is that they're not major things, but they're things that we see that pop up. Some of the items on this list are, and so at that point we'll talk about it. But the truth of it is that a lot of it's minor. So, one of the first things that we're taking a look at, typically we'll go through like plumbing, then electric, you got your roof, foundation, and then general other things like your appliances and everything else. Just to give you kind of a warning though, they're looking at appliances, they're looking at your HVAC, they're looking at those things, they're looking at your general date, and then they might be taking, pressures and temperatures in regards to, is it pumping out cold enough air? If so, looks like it's good. Check on the maintenance, has it been maintained? I have almost a 10-year-old system. It runs great. It runs very efficient. We have it maintained twice a year. However, if I was to put my house on the market, it would probably be dinged for coming to the end of the useful life. I'm going to run that thing until it dies. I know I'm probably going to need to replace it before we sell our house, but the idea that doesn't necessarily always disqualify, that if you have an older HVAC system, if it's been maintained, that at that point, you don't need to replace it necessarily. Just that would be, as we talked about in our previous video, that would come down to making sure that you're pricing appropriately and that you're stating the age of that HVAC system in your seller's disclosure statement. Prior to a buyer coming out and making an offer, if you have any known issues in the house, that ultimately your age of your roof, the age of your HVAC system, the age of your furnace, things like, is there, maybe your plumbing is one composite, maybe it's copper versus PVC or CPVC. None of these things are a problem. In fact, I tell sellers all the time, make sure that we just note it in there so that it's out in front for buyers, that they can evaluate ahead of making any offer and ahead of making any inspection. Because in my opinion, once we've disclosed it, that's what they're using to evaluate the property ahead of the inspection. Then at that point, their offer needs to be in accordance with the things that are already disclosed. I don't want to have to revisit HVAC unless there is something physically wrong with the HVAC that the seller, if they were going to be living in the house, would need to take care of in order for it to function going. But I'm not negotiating a new HVAC system out of a repair request. So same thing with the roof. There's nothing, if your roof, there are some challenges sometimes with roofs. I will say through not so much that in the inspection, but that, depending on the age of the roof, there could be challenges in regards to your cost for, home, for your home insurance. Your price could go up. Sometimes they may require that the roof be replaced. In terms of age and everything else. These would be questions that as a buyer, I would want to know ahead of making an offer, not having it be a surprise later. What's the age of the roof have to be? What are these things so that I know when I'm evaluating properties? Because, I think for buyers and sellers, when things pop up that are big expenses, I don't necessarily think that buyers are trying to do anything. I don't look at buyers that they're trying to do something wrong. But if they get news from their insurance company that they can't buy the house unless the roof is replaced, well, at that point, it's kind of, it's a shocking information. It's shocking information that at that point, like they go back to their agent and say, we have to do this. Well, asking a home seller to replace a roof, as part of a repair request versus, after thinking that they've already got one price and now they're going to have to invest in another is a challenge. So I would say, no, on both sides, there's some due diligence that needs to happen in order to prepare for these kinds of things. But like I said, if it's already been noted in the seller's disclosure, at that point, in my opinion, it's kind of off the table when we go to negotiation. But one of the things that we're looking at, when we start taking a look at one of the easiest, and we'll go kind of easiest to hard. So the easiest ones are little things like your faucets. Go check your faucets in each one of each bathroom. If you got a sink in your laundry room, for us, we rarely use that sink. I have no idea if it leaks or not. I don't know the last time I checked under. I was just thinking about it today as we were doing this. Like, I should probably practice what I preach. That you don't know, there could be a leak that has been going on in any of these areas. And it's just because of the fact that you hadn't been using them or just didn't really put a lot of thought into it. These are the kinds of things that'll be noted in an inspection report. And it could be something as simple as just it needs a rubber gasket in order to be able to keep it from leaking, or it's leaking from the handle, it's leaking from the base, or it's leaking from underneath. And so at that point, understanding those things will pop up, and a lot of times it's not a simple homeowner fix. Buyers are seeing plumbing and immediately want a licensed plumber to come out. Taking a look at things like shower diverters, the things that you pull up or flick up and down in the shower in order to be able to turn the shower. Some people have it permanently on to shower because if you're like me, I never take baths. I've got 2 tubs in my house and I use the shower primarily. And so at that point, like, I would really have no idea whether or not the diverter works in one or the other. My daughter, like, she uses hers all the time, but I know that it's constantly turned on to shower. So making sure that those things are going. If there's a leak or it doesn't work or it doesn't move up and down, if it's not 100%, that it goes all the way. It can't be any leak, any faucet, or any leak coming from the faucet while the diverter's on. So typically a pretty simple fix, but it's one that pops up a lot. The other is caulking, like going around and sealing, around the tub, around each one of the faucet, the handles, your shower, making sure that there's no water penetration that can get back behind the wall. Same thing in your kitchen, making sure that there's seal, on your backsplash, in your cabinets, or in your countertops, so that nothing's getting back into the cabinets. And in your bathrooms, same thing there, where there's nothing that can get back behind. You want to make sure that everything's as waterproofed as possible. If not, it will definitely get noted. And so at that point, just save yourself some of the headache and hassle on that one. The other is your water heater, okay? Now, there's debate back and forth. I would say, I talk to people, they love traditional water heaters. A lot of people I know that I have a tankless. I like it. I have, I've heard, some people that don't. In general, it doesn't really matter. Each one has its own challenges. Water heaters, depending on how old they are, when you take a look at, they typically sit in kind of in a pan itself, like a drip pan or a water pan. The idea that pan needs to be in good, like that it can't be broken, that it actually has to be in one piece, that there's not dust and debris, anything that could be misinterpreted as water leaking. If it's in your garage and you have sprayed the hose back and forth and it got in that pan, the home inspector doesn't know that you were washing your car and that's residue from 6 months ago when you were washing your car. They're just going to note that it looks like there's water in there, and that's going to need to be investigated. And typically, if it's water heater, AC, roof, these are all things that are going to require somebody to come out and actually sign off if you're going to get it done. So I would say make sure that the pan itself is either, has been cleaned out, is in one piece, and at that point, that your water heater itself, that all the connections are in good order. You'll see things on there where there's having a new water heater installed is going to require an expansion tank that, in case something happens at that point, from if it overflows or those kinds of things, that it has somewhere else that it can go without, exploding the water heater. Older water heaters may not have those things. That's not to say that you have to run out and get one, but just be aware that, what was the standard at the time that was put together. It also can signify age. So if in doubt, I would say take a look at water heater in general and see about if it looks like it's going to be too old and those kinds of things, that maybe you have a little bit more control in getting quotes and getting evaluations before you go on market or before the home inspection than you do when you're trying to figure it out. Because a lot of times people are like, we got to move in 3 weeks. So, we're making decisions based on need and speed versus sound financial choices. So I would say get ahead of those kinds of things. Take a look at it. If in doubt, call a plumber, have them come out and take a look at it. Plumbers will know immediately the things that they're seeing on home inspections. So, those would be the kinds of things. And then if you have a tankless water heater, this is something where a lot of people don't realize is that tankless water heaters on a periodic basis have to be descaled. So, having that maintenance done on those things ahead of home inspections would make a big difference, because at the end of it, that's, there's no tankless water heaters, in my opinion. I like them. Some people don't, just because of the fact that it could take a little while for things to warm up, but it's an instant on, not constantly running at all times. But like anything else, it still needs maintenance. It's not without its own maintenance. And some of it can be, depending on the kind that you have and those kinds of things, then your maintenance could be a little bit on the higher side. So just make sure that you've got those things done, because they will pop up on the report. And that, gas fixtures, anything that's gas related, that all of your hoses are connected, they're hand tight, that they're not moving around. Speaking of plumbing, that those are the kinds of things that will trying to get somebody to come out and do that when it was something as simple as just, doing a half crank, it's really frustrating. But then one of the other things that we see is, light bulbs. Okay. Your light bulbs throughout the house, where it's like, I walk through a house and in the vanity has five lights, and there's, a lot of times I walk in and there's one that's burned out. Go through the house and make sure that all your light bulbs are in working order. You want to make sure that that everything is, that if that light fixture's got 6 bulbs, it needs 6 working bulbs. It is, I see it all. I see that. I see where, and then out of the bulbs, that the color temperature is different. So you'll have this beautiful chandelier with, 12 different lights. And in the center, there's 2 day glow and the rest of them are all warm white. Can make the light bulbs consistent. Personally, I hate day glow. I think day glow reminds me of being in a dentist office or doctor's office. It's too sterile. It's too bright. I feel like it sucks all the light out, especially if you have different color tones of paint within the house. I feel like it can skew things. I'm just not a big day glow, but it doesn't matter. If the day glow is what you're using, make sure that it's day glow in everything. My photographer will thank you for that. I mean, the idea that it makes it so much easier from a photography standpoint, from a consistent of look, but you can see it right off the front. And then look at your light fixtures too. This is not really something that pops up into your inspection report, but it does show the idea of just upkeep and maintenance. If you've got, there's the bowl lights that people will have where it's got the glass and you basically put the 2 lights in, screw it up. It seems like every builder in the 80s and 90s was using some form variation of that light bulb. The idea that it doesn't really cost a lot of money to make a big impact, especially if you're trying to sell your house, and it shows that you've been trying to, that you're working to keep it up to date. That the idea of a $30 fixture and just kind of giving a different look and feel can really change that. So I would highly recommend going through and evaluating some of those light fixtures and see where you're at. The other would be your LEDs. You used to have the can lights. Now you've kind of got the flush LEDs in terms of your floodlights throughout. These are things if you're looking at fixtures, and I would say it's not necessarily something that's going to be noted by the home inspector so much, but it is something that's going to be noted by a buyer when it comes down to making an offer in regards to what they're gonna want to do. So it's not super expensive to take care of. I mean, it's not going to say that it doesn't come with an expense, but the idea of updating your lighting really does go a long way, and it's something that buyers truly appreciate. So now, one of the things is in terms of talking electric, your circuit box. One I see it almost on every inspection is that the breaker box itself was not labeled. So if you've got a breaker box and there's no labels in it, just get ready. You're going to have to do it. And a lot of times it's, sometimes they want, I don't know why they want this, where they want an electrician to do it. You don't need an electrician to label the box. But in my opinion, I'm not saying that it's not important, but the idea is that as a homeowner, you kind of know where things are moving and you turn on and off and get a general idea of where things are. Label it. Go get, you can get those little labels at Office Depot or Staples, for $3 and 30 minutes of time, having somebody walk around, being able to label and give that. One, I think that it gives a buyer a sense of that homeowner does know what's going on and is taking the time to update and make it convenient. And at the end of it, your home inspector will keep it from being it. Home inspector is not going to go to every breaker to make sure that you labeled everything correctly, but the idea is that there's no attempt in labeling. It'll automatically get dinged, and it will be something that, even if it doesn't cost you any money, it's frustrating when I see it, because at the end of it, it's such a simple fix. So the other from electric, that nowadays everything has to be grounded. All of your outlets have to be grounded. Some, depending on where they are in proximity to water, or from a safety perspective, need to be GFI or GFCI in order to be able to keep somebody from electrocuting themselves while, cooking, cleaning, or bathing. And so understanding where all of those things are, getting ahead of it. A lot of times, if you've got where the idea that the kitchen has outlets and it may be grounded somewhere else, but it's requiring a GFCI, if you know how to do it, you can do that yourself, and it's a lot less expensive than hiring an electrician who's going to charge you somewhere, anywhere between, seeing it as little as $75, as much as $150, just to take a $20 part and put it in the wall. So at that point, getting ahead of those things where you can, even if you need to hire somebody to come out and do it, you can at least dictate the terms a little bit more and hopefully shop around to be able to find the best deal. And I think that's where a lot of times you're just, the price is going up on you, because people know these people want to sell their house, and they got to sell their house, and they're going to need somebody to fix these things. So, so anyway, take a look at that. The other would be if you're little things, but if you're the actual outlet itself, or the outlet cover was white and now start to turn a dingy orange or something like that, take the time and replace those things. Not for any other reason outside of the fact that people will notice it. I notice it when I walk in. It's one of the first things that a lot of buyers I work with, where it can tell, looks like they're automatically dating a house based on the color of outlets, and it's not always indicative of their age. It could, but it definitely does. So I would walk around and do a critical evaluation and say, is this, if I'm moving to a new house, was that how this house was that we're buying? These kinds of things and I think it goes a long way. And also too, you want to make sure that all those outlets are working. Making sure that each one works. There's been plenty of times where we'll get back, there's, out of the entire house, there's 3 outlets that are not working, and the homeowner was unaware that it wasn't there. So, take either a lamp, or you can get those the testers that plug it in to tell you whether or not there's power or not. I would highly recommend it. It doesn't take very long, and ultimately it would save you in that will need an electrician many times, just because of the fact that, in order to figure out why it's inoperable. Same thing with your light bulbs. If you've got light bulbs that are out, going back to the light bulb scenario, if it doesn't work, the inspector is going to note it as inoperable. And so at that point, it could potentially be a repair request that comes back, or at the very minimum, it's going to be, can you plug a light bulb in, take a picture, and send it to me? I've done that quite a bit too, in order to be able to get it off. What I would say, and this is not necessarily a repair request as much as it is just a conversation in and around overall condition of the property. Paint. When we talk about paint, I think one of the biggest, I'm not saying that it's not inexpensive, but one of the easiest ways and one of the least expensive ways to really freshen up a house is to have it repainted. You come in, when you've lived somewhere for a reasonable amount of time, you don't notice the handprints, you don't notice the dinge, you don't notice those things until you start moving all your furniture out, and then you can see the lines where things were. Well, when somebody's coming to evaluate your house, they definitely see that. And at that point, I just think that paint is one of the easiest ways to just kind of turn a home, somebody's that property into something great. So, and looking at your color choice, making sure that it's a lighter color, not hard colors, not dark colors, making it as bright, where it is. I would say off-white, white, there's a couple of different color paints that I would recommend, in regards to that are popular and that are very, very neutral and do well. The other is when somebody goes through their house, they'll always be like, I'm leaving this paint behind for them. I'm more worried about the color code, and I'm not worried about the paint. Because once that paint's been sitting in your garage or wherever it's been sitting for 2, 3, 10 years, it's great that we know what the color was originally, but just like anything else, the paint that's on the wall, well, the paint that's in that can will start to also, start to oxidize and start to change form. So things like the color itself, the sheen starts to change. So it's like walking into a home, on in terms of if I'm looking to list a property and working with the home seller, when I meet them at the house, or if I'm walking a buyer through, one of the first things that I'll see is you can see these brush strokes of we touched up, we did. It's like, you might as well just painted the whole wall. And in fact, that's what I would tell you. If you're going to do touch up, don't do touch up in a spot touch up. Do the touch up on a solid wall. If it's a 4-corner wall, do it on one, because you're not going to notice the color change so much on a solid wall compared to another wall, because there can be shadows and things like that will do it. But I will definitely notice that if I'm looking at the same color on the same wall, I will notice that for a fact. And I will tell you that because I work with a painter. Sean will tell you is that's one of my biggest pet peeves. I walk in and I'm like, holy cow, I can see where the cut in is. I can see where this is. And what even in, it could be the same paint bought at the same store a day apart from each other. That one can will have even though they've done color matching and they've got science and everything else like this, there is no such thing as perfect match. So it could be different, as it carries from one can to the other. So, I always say, don't start painting, don't paint halfway, and change to a new can, because at that point you might as well just paint the whole wall again. So, it's those kinds of things. The other is when you're looking at your sheen level in these paints, I think one of the biggest things to me is semi-gloss drives me crazy. It's so, it's just the gloss itself has a reflect. The other is that with semi-gloss, you can see pretty much every imperfection in the wall. If it had been repaired at some point, if it, unless it's all been redone perfectly, the reality is you'll see kind of the bends and divots and those kinds of things that may be there even after the repair. So I would say move more towards the flat, matte style, or, I personally, I'm not a huge fan of flat if I'm going to be living with it. I think it looks good when you're moving into a property, but I honestly feel that eggshell is probably more livable, at least for my family. It gives you kind of a mattish finish, but it's not super glossy. And at that point, it's not that it can't, it's a little bit easier to clean in that it still has that kind of the benefit of the semi-gloss, in that I'm not going to smear something on it. It's it's a little bit easier to clear, but it's not without its own faults. But again, you're going to be moving from the house. So it's not, all we got to do is get through the sale. But I would say take a look at paint. Paint does a lot. The other is like baseboards and those kinds of things. I will say that I don't think that you need to do baseboards on a mat. Some may argue with me, some may not. I think that, semi-gloss on those things are not necessarily bad, but at the end of it, I'll leave that up for debate. I have my own personal opinions, and that doesn't mean that I'm right or wrong, but I would say across the board on the walls at the very minimum, try to stay more towards that matte aspect versus where that is. The other, that wood in general here in South Carolina, we run into, with moisture, we do have termites here. So, that the idea that your deck, outside coverings, if they're wood constructed, making sure that you've got that these things are up, maintained. So, if the handrails themselves are starting to deteriorate, or maybe, they're starting to crumble, it happens. A lot of times homeowners are not really that concerned about it. It's something that's going to pop up in the home inspection report for sure, in that it needs to be replaced or repaired. And depending on what kind of funding that buyer of your property is using, if they're using FHA or VA, it would be required before they would close. It would fall into not just the home inspection, but the actual FHA and VA appraisers. A lot of times they're coming back out and doing a reinspection. And I have had two scenarios. One where we ended up doing repairs. I worked with a seller with that. Like we needed to get the floorboards, the handrails, and everything else like that updated. Thankfully, my client was also like a carpenter, or at least had skills in carpentry, that he was able to do most of that work and get it repaired. On the other side, we represented a buyer, and actually, I talked to my client and we advised the seller just to get rid of the deck, because we knew it was going to, both the selling agent and myself knew that if left up to a VA appraiser, it was probably going to get dinged. And so why go through all the hassle with that seller if at the end of it my buyer didn't care about it and was going to do something different? Why even create more question marks than we needed to? So they ended up getting rid of it, and then ended up just building a staircase down, because we needed the staircase with the handrails on either side, given the width of where we were. So we just wanted to navigate that, knowing that we could see that it was a job that he was going to do anyway, and he wanted to do it to his own taste. So at that point, we just gave him a better canvas to play with, and got the deal done. So looking at those kinds of things, sometimes it's a decision tree. If in doubt, talk to an agent. Really get together with an agent to find out what's going on in the market. If you're in my market, I would love the opportunity to talk with you about it. We can look at it. Sometimes, you can over repair or you can overdo, when at the end of it, are you really going to make return on it? And so at that point, that would be one that I would say really talk with an agent to find out what they're seeing in the market. The big thing, but as we start talking about wood, we start talking about termites. I think it's important in South Carolina to have a termite bond. It definitely helps in regards to making sure that your house is protected and insured against wood, from termite damage specifically. But most homes in South Carolina, or a lot of homes, I should say, are built on crawl spaces. So basically, it's an air gap between the ground and the base level, or the foundation of the house. And so with the undercarriage of a house is typically wood, and it's laid on top of these pedestals in your crawl space to keep it up. But in that crawl space, you've got ground. So if that ground will, when it rains, when it moves, moisture's moving in and around, and then you add in heat, you create humidity within that crawl space, and humidity is what is great when it comes down to wood-eating bacteria, algae, mold. There's a variety of things that could be created in that environment if it's not ventilated correctly, if it's not managed correctly. So what you'll see in crawl spaces a lot of times, you'll either see vapor barriers. There are some that are fully encapsulated. There's dehumidification systems that go on in order to be able to keep the balance for crawl spaces that may not have enough ventilation, or that maybe it's that. So you want to look at this. This would be one of these things that I would say as a homeowner. There's a few of these things that I would take care of independently, and whether you're selling the house or not, you want to know what's going on in the crawl space. Like with anything else, most people aren't crawling up underneath their house on a quarterly or annual basis. In fact, I know people that have never been in their crawl space. And so at that point, things like you don't know what's going on down there. But, what I find in inspection reports in the crawl space outside of humidity levels are things like a lot of times your insulation is now padded or attached to the underside of the house to be able to keep, warmth, keep from having anything escape, either whether you're trying to keep it cool or warm during the winter or summer. You'll start to see it's almost like icicles is what but the moisture is now starting to, at that point, weigh down that insulation, making the home far less efficient. And that will be noted. And that's a first signal that there's a problem with moisture. Then at that point, they'll do a humidity reading because you've got two inspections. You got the whole home inspection, and then you have what's considered the CL 100, which is your termite and wood infestation report. So in that CL 100, they're going to go in and take a moisture reading. And if that moisture reading hovers over, 20%, then at that point it's what's considered risk, because that's the humidity percentage that has been known to be a great environment for all of those organisms to then start coming to life. And the damage to the underside, to the foundation of the house, you may not be aware of. So I would highly recommend taking a look at your crawl space, having somebody come out and potentially take a look at it, or just be aware. There's remedies for a lot of these things, unless it's something that's been ongoing or is like super bad. A lot of times it can be remedied either with a vapor barrier, encapsulating, putting a dehumidification system in, those kinds of things. But when you're trying to sell your house, it's one of those where it's also can be a time, there's a time element to it, which is, so I think being able to shop around, find the right solution for where it is, and do that, as though I would do it if I was in my, as a homeowner, whether I was selling the house or not. I evaluate all of the repairs that I'm willing to do in terms of, if I bought this house back today, what would be the repairs that I would be doing as the homeowner versus, what am I going to not do for a buyer coming in? Because, I will do these things because I want to protect the property. There are other things that I will push back on because of the fact that that it seems ridiculous, or I'll just ask for credit. So anyway, there's a lot of things to be aware of. I would say there are different games of thought that say inspection, pre-inspection, pre-home inspection, before going to market. We can do a video on that later about the pros and cons of those things. Sometimes knowing too much can be detrimental, and you can over repair, you can over prepare. But the truth is that, if you go through and just kind of like take a look at, the inspector is going to find something, but hopefully this list here will give you at least a head start and keep some of the money in your own pocket without having, too many that ding up on the inspection report. So if you get any value out of this, please like and subscribe our channel. We are, just really trying to educate, be a source of education for our clients, as well as, for the I guess general area here in the Greenville upstate, as well as beyond, because I think that these things these would be important things whether you're selling in the upstate or selling anywhere in the US. And so if you find any value out of this, we'd love for you to like and subscribe. We're trying to grow this channel and just kind of, increase awareness on what's going on here. And if you have any questions, or if you're, curious to know more about how to prepare, or in a decision of whether I should do this or not do that, you're more than welcome to reach out. Our contact information is down below. That is my cell phone number. I answer that phone pretty much anytime it rings, unless I'm with a client or doing something else. So I would love, to be able to help in any way I can. Even if you just want us to come and evaluate or have to take a look at something, just to get a second opinion. By no means am I an expert, nor am I an inspector, but I've just seen enough in the inspection reports that I feel like this would be helpful for people to understand, both going through the inspection report as well as just getting through the sale as a whole. So I hope you guys have a great night, and I look forward to seeing you soon.